Please, don't take my dog. He's all I have." Her voice shook under the freezing Seattle rain. An elderly woman curled against a wall, clutching a shivering German shepherd to her chest, like he was the last warm thing left in her life. And that's exactly how Michael Hayes, a former Navy SEAL, hardened by war and loss, found her. He had just left a high-paying security offer, yet felt nothing until he saw them. A forgotten grandmother, a loyal dog refusing to leave her side, rain pouring like judgment from the sky. Michael knelt slowly. "I'm not here to take him," he said. "I'm here to help." Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from, and if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. Rain threads stitched a gray curtain over Seattle's waterfront, the pier lights wavering like tired stars. Michael Hayes moved through the drizzle with a precision that never left his bones, even after the Navy had stamped his papers and saluted him into civilian silence. He was 33, 6 feet even, with a frame carved by years of calisthenics and the kind of patience that keeps men alive in rooms without windows. His jaw was square and close cut, the way instructors liked in training photos. But life had added its own edges, tiny white scars like punctuation along his cheekbone, and a thin, almost invisible line beneath his right eye from a splintered rotor wash incident in Helmand. Dark hair, clipped short in the habit of soldiers who trust nothing that flaps. A day and a half of stubble that blurred his face into someone slightly older. His eyes were a deep, unsettled blue, not the color of calm water, but the color of depths that hold wreckage. He walked with the balance of a man who'd learned to carry both weight and quiet, a black field jacket zipped to his collar and a knit beanie pulled low against the bite of the rain. People called him polite because he listened. Neighbors called him distant because he never offered what listening cost him. Before he turned onto Alaskan Way, he almost kept going because that was his new rule. Stick to the plan, replace absent platoons with routines, fill the space with grocery lists and gym reps and clipped conversations that ended with handshakes. But routine frays where the human heart snags. He saw the shape first, a low mound beneath a corrugated awning beside a shuttered souvenir shop, the kind that sells glass floats and postcards of a city that pretends it is made only of summer. The awning gutter spat rain and choked rattles, and the mound shifted, and a dog lifted its head. The dog was a German shepherd, big-boned and resolute, with a saddle of deep sable across his back and a dusting of gray at the muzzle that put him somewhere between 5 and 7. His ears, one nicked as if fate had taken a small bite, pricked even as his body curled to shield the figure beneath him. His coat had the dullness of weeks without a proper brush, but even under grime there was the sheen of strong genetics, the barrel chest and straight spine of a working line. He watched the world with the bright, wary composure of animals who have learned to predict kicks and kindness with the same accuracy. Later, Michael would decide the dog's name should have always been Bruno because it felt inevitable, heavy, loyal, grounded, but in that first moment, he only recognized another sentry working a midnight shift. The figure under the blanket stirred, an elderly woman, the kind that time makes smaller but no less present. She sat up, and the rain showed him her face, and he understood at once that the world had been careless with her, and she had continued anyway. Margaret Lewis, though he did not know her name yet, was somewhere past 70, 5'3" when standing straight, with a spine that kept trying to remember pride. She had the thin, careful hands of someone who used to sew hems and button school uniforms, and a face mapped by fine lines at the eyes and mouth, the gentle calligraphy of old laughter and the heavier chiseling of recent grief. Her hair, once auburn by the look of it, had gone winter white at the temples and silver elsewhere, pulled into a loose bun with a rubber band and a stubbornness that refused to quit. Her skin held the pale translucence of age and the windburn rouge of sidewalk nights, and her clothes were a careful collage, a navy peacoat with missing buttons, a gray sweater 2 sizes large, men's corduroy trousers cinched with a string, and sneakers that kept their shape mostly through hope. She wore no makeup, no jewelry, and no expression that asked for pity. If anything, the set of her jaw said, "Let's not make a scene." But her eyes, clear hazel, with old light in them, flicked to Michael and paused, not in fear, but in assessment. Here was a man, big and damp and watchful, carrying himself like he did not want to take up space. A man who moved his feet as if floors could crack. A man who had learned to avoid sudden angles because sudden angles wore triggers. Bruno's attention folded around Michael and then slowly softened. Not into trust, but into a readiness to consider it. The rain made introductions. It tapped on the awning, hissed along the street, crept under the cuffs of Michael's jacket, trickled down Margaret's cheek like a thin, impatient finger. Michael felt the old calibration spin up in his chest. Distance to target, field of view, threat assessment, and corrected himself, ashamed and grateful, because the battlefield was empty, and he did not want to keep living like it wasn't. He took in the details that mattered now. The damp seam where the awning failed, the plastic tote bag with a folded blanket, and a neatly packed tin of dog kibble, the paper cup, rinsed and inverted, the way organized people do things even when nothing else obeys. Beneath the peacoat, Margaret's shoulders trembled in small, held-back shivers, the kind of shivering that says, "I will not make noise about this." It wasn't heroism, it was courtesy. And it worked like a key in a lock Michael had pretended not to have. He had promised himself after the last deployment that he would not become a rescuer looking for fires, that he would not mistake other people's struggles for missions designed to rescue him. But his therapist, Dr. Elena Park, a woman in her 40s who wore mustard cardigans and an expression of vast humane curiosity, had said, "Service is not the opposite of healing. Just promise me you'll see people, not problems." So he saw. He saw that Margaret had cleaned Bruno's ears with the corner of a napkin, that her tote contained a small, battered paperback of Mary Oliver's poems, its spine cracked at wild geese, the paper gone soft with readings, that she had arranged her sleeping place as if it were a parlor, the blanket squared, the tote tucked, the world invited to pass with minimum friction. He saw, too, the surviving elegance in how she tilted her chin. It suggested she had once hosted dinners, once organized carpools, once kept a calendar of birthdays and hummed while making soup. Loss had rewritten the house, but not the handwriting. Michael Zippin tried to bargain with him. Just leave a bill, just move on, kindness at arm's length. But something else, older, spoke louder. The memory of a night in Kandahar when the mission was to hold a corridor, and the real mission was to carry a 19-year-old private's panic without letting it touch air. He crouched beside the edge of the awning, his knees popping in a way that reminded him he was choosing a different life now. The smell of wet dog and cold wool rose like a small, honest weather system. Bruno leaned forward on his elbows, paws flat, the canine version of a question mark. Up close, Michael noticed a faint scar ridging Bruno's left foreleg, a healed cut likely from chain link or bramble, and teeth that were clean despite the circumstances, evidence of consistent care. The dog's eyes, a rich brown wet with rain, settled and held. There was no melodrama in the exchange, simply, "I am who I am. Are you who you are?" Margaret drew her coat tighter in a motion that was part practical, part symbolic, and surveyed Michael with the air of a school principal, deciding whether to loan out the good scissors. In that gaze, he felt grasped and weighed and, somehow, not found wanting. She cleared her throat, and though the wind tried to whisk it away, the sound carried the grain of someone who had managed crisis by naming tasks, not feelings. In another life, she might have said, "Chairs first, then tea, then we decide." In this life, she said nothing, because dignity had taught her the algebra of silence. In his chest, Michael felt a flutter that wasn't fear and wasn't exactly hope. It was recognition. The city had turned him into a shadow who did pull-ups at midnight and drank coffee that tasted like penance. But this moment, 3 souls under a leaking awning, called forth the version of him his teammates knew, the one who cracked dry jokes during comms checks, the one who shared water without asking, the one who could stand still long enough for another person to compose themselves. He shrugged out of his jacket in a motion that pretended the rain wasn't cold, and held it, not toward Margaret like an order, but near her like an option, letting Bruno smell the sleeve first. Bruno sniffed, decided the offering contained no sharp edges, and nudged it with the philosophical acceptance of a dog who understands alliances. Margaret slid into the jacket with the graceful awkwardness of someone who still remembers small luxuries. The linings retained heat, climbed her arms, and uncurled along her neck. She closed her eyes for a fraction, long enough for the body to understand it was allowed to believe in warmth again, short enough for pride to pretend nothing had happened. Inside that brief, private dark, she revisited a memory she seldom allowed, her son David at 23, tall and laughing, waving a spatula in a kitchen the color of lemons, him in a firefighter's navy t-shirt, promising to stop by after shift, the ringing phone at 3:14 a.m., when voices learn how to break. Grief, she had learned, doesn't actually dull. It simply becomes familiar enough to greet with a nod. She opened her eyes and found the present waiting politely. Michael felt his own memories stir. A helicopter evening, the churn of sand, Novak's grin, the way fate invents rules you can't train for, and tamped it back down with the practiced kindness he used on himself on good days. He didn't believe in providence, and he didn't disbelieve it, but he had learned to accept assignments that arrived in the language of ordinary need. Above them, a fairy horn sounded, long and low, and the street's lights blinked as if woken by their own persistence. A busker across the way, thin, ponytailed, the kind of kid who turns metaphors into rent, packed his guitar into a case lined with receipts and hope. A dock worker in a neon vest angled a dolly through puddles, with the resigned grace of people who move weight for a living. The city was not cruel, it was simply busy. Michael stood and offered a hand to help Margaret rise, not because he thought she couldn't, but because offering is a language that heals the speaker. She accepted not because she was weak, but because accepting is a language that heals the world. Bruno rose too, shook water into a glittering halo, and arranged himself on Margaret's left side, with the sleek readiness of a shepherd who has chosen. This was how a family begins, not with revelations, but with arrangements. Michael glanced at the street, at the sliding sheets of rain, at the way the horizon was trying on dawn behind a warehouse stack. He did the math. Distance to his apartment, towels in the closet, soup in the pantry, a spare blanket. The knowledge that one night can be a bridge if someone keeps it from collapsing, and felt the click of decision seat itself into his spine. He didn't draw a line through his old vows. He added a line under them. Not everything is a mission, but some things are a promise. The promise tonight was small and absolute. Keep them warm, make tomorrow possible, ask questions later. And as the three of them stepped away from the awning and into the soft insistence of the rain, the city watched without remark, the way cities do when miracles dress as errands. Inside Michael's apartment, warmth settled slowly, as if unsure it was allowed to exist there. The air tasted of boiled water and old wood floors. The radiator hissed like a tired old man complaining about being woken. The kitchen lamp, a single amber bulb with a crooked shade he had never bothered to fix, spread a soft glow across the small space. It was not a home designed for guests. It was a holding place for a man who existed between wars, between expectations, between versions of himself. But tonight, it became a harbor. Margaret's breathing steadied into a gentle cadence as she dozed on the couch. The fabric was worn, patches at the seams showing where Michael had mended it himself after a knife edge on his duty belt snagged it years ago. Bruno lay on the rug, long limbs folded neatly beneath him, head lifted just enough so one brown eye could track everything at once. The dog's presence radiated vigilance. Even asleep, Margaret's hand rested on his flank, the way a heartbeat rests in the chest, something instinctive. Michael moved with careful stillness, using quiet not out of habit but out of reverence. The kettle rumbled on the stove, and steam curled around the chipped blue mug he placed next to the sink. He wasn't sure why the ritual, steeping tea, folding towels, adjusting the lamp, felt like preparation for something sacred. He told himself he was just doing what needed to be done, but some part of him knew. People who have spent years saving lives can spot moments that save theirs in return. He hung his jacket over a chair, feeling the absence of weight on his shoulders like a strange new freedom. The chair creaked. Bruno's ears twitched. "Easy," Michael murmured, not as command but as promise. Bruno blinked once, a soldier recognizing another. Michael brewed chamomile tea, because that was what his therapist recommended on sleepless nights. The mug warmed his palms, and his hands trembled slightly, not from cold, but from the unfamiliarity of being needed by someone without a mission objective. On the coffee table lay a stack of mail he had ignored for days. A flyer for a veteran support group, a postcard from a former teammate now working security in Nevada, and an overdue bill folded into government beige. He pushed them aside and placed the tea within reach of the sleeping woman. She did not stir. She looked smaller in sleep, shoulders bowed inward as if protecting memories nobody could take. Hair, loosened from its bun, fanned gently over the blanket like delicate frost. Michael noticed the texture of her hands, thin, knuckles enlarged slightly, fingers marked by faint scars from burns or needle pricks. Domestic scars, the kind that come from years of doing things for others. He wondered who had once been the others: family, husband, Son? The question hovered in his mind, and something like shame surfaced. How quick people were to assume homelessness was born from irresponsibility, not from a cascade of grief no one could outrun. There was a rustle at the door, keys fumbling. Michael straightened, shoulders tightening instinctively. Then the door opened, and Jenna Alvarez stepped inside. She was his neighbor across the hall, 28, Latina, and worked night shifts at Harborview Medical Center. Petite and compact, with curly dark hair tied high, light brown skin, and tired eyes lined with determination, she moved like someone always 10 seconds from the next emergency. Jenna carried grocery bags and kicked the door shut with her heel. She froze at the sight in front of her. Unexpected elderly woman wrapped in blankets. Big German shepherd on the rug. Ex-seal standing like a guilty statue. Jenna blinked, eyes moving from one figure to the next. She was, by nature, quick to evaluate severity. Nurse instinct. Michael watched her gaze soften rather than sharpen. She didn't scream, didn't demand explanations. She simply took a slow breath and set her groceries down. Long story, Michael said. Jenna wasn't tall, but she radiated authority. Everyone in the building liked her because she never wasted time pretending life was tidy. You finally let someone in, she said, voice low and teasing. When she walked toward the couch, Bruno rose just enough to place himself between her and Margaret. Not aggressive, just clear. Jenna extended the back of her hand for him to smell, a practiced calm that came from treating frightened creatures at the ER. Bruno sniffed, then lowered his head. Permission granted. I'll get extra blankets, Jenna whispered. For a moment, Michael's chest tightened painfully in gratitude. He wasn't used to kindness coming without strings, without strategies. Jenna returned with a soft gray blanket, her spare, and tucked it lightly around Margaret's legs. Margaret shifted, sighing, half waking, but not alarmed. Bruno placed his head back down, satisfied. Jenna leaned near Michael and whispered, "You okay?" Michael wasn't sure what to answer. Okay was not a familiar category. Being shot at had given him clarity. Being seen, however, left him unarmed. I just couldn't leave them there, he said. Jenna studied him, expression melting from professional to gentle. That's the best thing I've heard from you in 2 years of shared walls. She squeezed his forearm, brief, grounding, and slipped back to her apartment. Silence returned, a silence that felt like breathing together. Michael stood a long time just watching the scene. Margaret asleep, Bruno finally at rest, the tea cooling on the table. He sat on the floor beside Bruno and leaned his back against the couch. The dog lifted his head, placing it on Michael's knee. Michael's vision blurred at the edges. Not quite tears, just a softening of something that had stayed armored too long. He let his hand rest on Bruno's fur. The dog accepted the touch, and then, in a gesture filled with a strange nobility, shifted, closer until their ribs touched. Michael hadn't known how much he needed that. Hours later, the sky lightened from charcoal to quiet pearl. Margaret stirred awake. She blinked, confused at the unfamiliar ceiling, then recognized warmth on her shoulders, the blanket, the steady breathing of Bruno. Her world arranged itself back into sense. When her gaze drifted to Michael, she found him leaning against the couch, head tipped, asleep sitting upright. He looked younger like that, less carved by ghosts. Margaret watched him with something like disbelief and gratitude mingled into one emotion. She had known loss. She had known abandonment. But this, someone staying, felt miraculous. She lowered her hand slowly onto Michael's forearm, the same way a mother shapes reassurance without a word. He woke instantly. Training never fully leaves, but when he saw her, he softened. "You're safe," he said quietly. She nodded, overwhelmed by how rare it was for someone to say that and mean it. She touched Bruno's ear and felt hope, faint but real, stir in her chest. Michael stood and offered her the tea. She wrapped both hands around it and held it close, inhaling warmth into lungs that had forgotten softness. Bruno rose and leaned against her knees protectively, as if to say, "We stay, right?" Michael looked at both of them and knew the truth had already taken root. The night had begun as an accident. It ended as a beginning. The first beginning Michael had allowed himself in a long, long time. Morning filtered through the blinds in soft stripes, brushing the small apartment with pale winter light. Michael Hayes stood in the tiny kitchenette, boiling water again. Not for tea this time, but because his hands needed something to do while his mind sorted through the storm that had settled inside him. Margaret sat at the small dining table, shoulders slightly hunched, the blanket still wrapped around her like armor she had not yet decided she could remove. Bruno lay at her feet, his large German shepherd head resting on her shoes, guarding her, as if the floor beneath them might betray her at any second. Michael watched her quietly. In daylight, the contrast between her dignity and her exhaustion was even clearer. Her silver hair was combed neatly now, smoothed by her own trembling hands after waking, her hazel eyes still watchful but no longer filled with the distrust of last night. Her clothes, too thin for Seattle winters, were folded neatly beside her, revealing the habit of someone who had once owned drawers, rooms, routines. Margaret had eaten the oatmeal he prepared with careful, slow bites, as though savoring not just the food, but the normalcy. Bruno occasionally nudged her knee, and she rewarded him with absent-minded strokes to the fur behind his ears. The dog's loyalty radiated from every movement, chin high, chest broad, tail sweeping in slow arcs when Michael approached. Michael finally set the coffee down and cleared his throat. "I want to help you get back on your feet," he said simply. Margaret didn't speak, but her eyes flickered with something between hope and fear. A person who had learned that hope can sometimes be the cruelest lie. Instead of pushing, Michael turned away and grabbed his laptop. It was an old military-issued model, dented at one corner from being thrown into a duffel during a mission extraction. He sat at the bar counter and opened the browser. He thought he was prepared to search, but the moment he typed Margaret Lewis into the search bar, his hands hesitated. Not because he doubted her, but because he feared what he might find. The page loaded slowly on the building's aging Wi-Fi. When her name appeared in an old news headline, his breath caught. Local firefighter killed in warehouse collapse. Leaves behind, elderly mother. A photo accompanied the article. In it, a tall man stood grinning in front of a red ladder truck, helmet tucked beneath his arm. Strong jaw, light freckles across his nose, hair as dark as fresh coffee. His name, David Lewis, age 32. A firefighter, a hero, Margaret's son. Michael glanced toward her. She sat still, eyes scanning the apartment, fingertips tracing the ceramic mug as if grounding herself. He opened another link. Insurance paperwork. Claim denied. The reason? Insufficient documentation. Claim cannot be processed. A stamped phrase in bold haunted the page. Final decision. Appeal closed. Michael felt something cold settle in his chest. He knew. Bureaucracy, but this wasn't bureaucracy. It was cruelty dressed in formality. Then came another document, foreclosure notice. The house, Margaret's house, seized due to unpaid fees she could not cover after medical bills and funeral costs had swallowed everything. There were records of calls she had made, requests, appeals, attempts to reason with people whose voices were trained to sound empathetic while denying compassion. She had been erased in slow motion, not by fate, but by systems designed to forget people like her. Michael closed the laptop carefully, not slamming it even though every muscle in him wanted to. He looked at Margaret again. She did not know he had seen everything. She was lightly scratching Bruno's fur, lost in thought. Michael sat across from her and studied her face, noticing, truly noticing, the fragility beneath her resilience. "Margaret," he said gently, "I found information about your son." She froze. The room stilled with her. Her eyes lifted to his with a weight that felt older than the building. Michael described the articles and documents. Not every detail, not yet. Just enough. Her lips pressed together, trembling. For a moment he thought she would speak. Instead, she simply nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of a pain too familiar to narrate. Michael pushed a tissue box across the table. Margaret didn't cry. Her eyes only glistened before steadying into something sharp as glass. "He died helping others," she whispered, voice small but steady. And the world moved on. Bruno made a soft rumbling sound in his chest, sensing the shift in her breath. Michael leaned forward, lowering his voice with the same gentleness he used when calming a panicked soldier in a dark corridor overseas. "He didn't deserve that, and neither do you." Margaret swallowed. She didn't respond. Her silence wasn't rejection, it was survival. Michael stood, pacing once around the small room before stopping near the window. He watched cars pass on the street below, regular people with regular mornings. Something inside him tightened. He was still recovering from the weight of his own past, still learning to navigate the world with no mission briefing, no orders. But now, for the first time in years, something felt clear. Not tactical clarity, the kind that told him where to breach or how to angle fire, but moral clarity. "You're staying here," he said. Margaret tensed. "I don't want to be a burden." Michael shook his head. "You're not. You survive more than anyone should have to." She blinked rapidly, caught between disbelief and exhaustion. "And where exactly do I fit in your life?" He considered the question. The truth came to him simply. "Right where you are." Bruno, as if understanding, nudged Margaret and then padded toward Michael, planting himself at his feet. His tail swept the floor twice. Agreement. In that small apartment, in that fragile morning light, a choice was made, not loudly, not ceremonially. A worn-out former SEAL, a grieving elderly woman, and a loyal dog formed a silent alliance. Michael spent the next hours making space. He gave Margaret the bedroom and took the couch. He fetched clean towels, changed pillowcases, rearranged his small closet to fit a few of her things. Bruno watched every movement, pacing behind Michael with steady steps, almost supervising. Mid-morning, Michael ventured downstairs to the building laundry room. A man was already there, Tobin Reed, a tenant on the third floor. Tobin was in his 50s, tall and lanky, with a faded rock band t-shirt stretched over his narrow torso. His salt and pepper hair stuck out like he'd just pulled off a motorcycle helmet. He repaired guitars for a living and smelled faintly of sawdust and varnish. Tobin had a sharp tongue with strangers, but a soft heart for underdogs, both human and musical instruments. He raised an eyebrow. "New roommate?" Michael shrugged. "Temporary guest." Tobin loaded another washer. "Temporary becomes permanent around here. This place eats lonely people and spits out community." Michael cracked a small smile despite himself. Tobin had a way of sounding like a sarcastic prophet. Back upstairs, he found Margaret folded over the small dresser he'd cleared, carefully arranging her few belongings with the reverence of someone setting up a shrine. Bruno lay on the floor beside her, tail sweeping, satisfied. Michael stood in the doorway, watching them the way one watches a sunrise, quiet, reverent, aware that change had arrived not with thunder, but with soft, persistent footsteps. This wasn't a mission. And yet, somehow, he knew he would die before letting her go back to the sidewalk. Because war had taught him many things, but this was new. Sometimes the enemy isn't a person. Sometimes it's what the world allows to happen to good people when nobody is watching. The first week after Margaret and Bruno moved in unfolded like a quiet lesson in cohabitation. 3 souls learning the shape of each other's breathing. Michael Hayes woke earlier than both of them, a habit carved into muscle memory from years of pre-dawn deployment calls. He brewed coffee in silence, filling the tiny apartment with the deep, comforting smell of roasted beans. Then he stood at the sink, mug in hand, watching the soft glow of sunrise slip over the rooftops like pale watercolor. Behind him, the apartment began to wake in small, gentle sounds. Bruno rising from Margaret's bedside, the soft thud of a large dog stretching and shaking off sleep, the swish of blankets as Margaret sat up, her joints stiff but her heart steadier than before. Margaret entered the kitchen in her newly laundered sweater, navy blue, a little frayed at the sleeves but clean now, and nodded in greeting. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, her hazel eyes clearer with rest. "Morning," she said quietly. There was still hesitancy in her voice, as if every word needed permission. Bruno followed at her heels, fur brushed to a healthy sheen, after Michael's patient work with a dog grooming brush he'd bought at a nearby store. The German Shepherd walked with confident strides now, chest broadened again from security and consistent meals. His tail flicked once as he settled by Margaret's chair, eyes softened, body relaxed yet alert. A warrior finally allowed rest. Michael served oatmeal and fruit, setting the bowls on the small table without ceremony. Margaret touched Bruno's head. "Eat," she murmured, but Bruno waited until Michael sat down too, like a soldier waiting for the signal from his commanding officer. That simple act, Bruno sharing trust, hit Michael harder than he expected. After breakfast, Michael grabbed a folder from the counter, marked Veteran Outreach and Support Office. Inside was paperwork for Margaret, temporary ID registration, senior housing programs, food assistance options. The forms weren't solutions, just openings, but openings mattered. "Ready to go?" he asked. Margaret hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the door the way someone stares at a cliff edge they aren't sure they can climb. Leaving the apartment meant stepping into the world that had failed her. "We'll go together," Michael added, voice steady as weathered stone. That was what eased her fear. Not the words themselves, but the way he said we instead of you. The city was washed clean by overnight rain, sidewalks painted with reflections of traffic lights. Michael walked on the right, Margaret on the left, Bruno centered perfectly between them. Heads turned as they passed. People naturally noticed a tall, sharp-edged man with military posture, walking beside a fragile elderly woman and a powerful German shepherd. At the support center, the receptionist, Alyssa Monroe, greeted them. She was in her early 30s, tall and slender, with tightly braided dark blonde hair and pale skin that flushed easily with emotion. Her eyes were green behind square-framed glasses, and she wore a maroon cardigan with a silver name tag. Alyssa had a calm, organized aura, like someone who had memorized the rhythm of chaos. She noticed Bruno first. "What a beautiful dog," she said, reaching for a form. When she spoke to Margaret, her voice lowered in warmth rather than pity. Not everyone had that skill. Michael filled out the paperwork, writing Margaret's information carefully, aware that every line represented another reminder of what she'd lost. Address, employment history, emergency contacts. Each blank space felt like a wound. When Alyssa asked for identification, Margaret's voice wavered. "I don't have anything left." Alyssa paused, and in that moment her professional expression shifted into genuine compassion. "Then we start fresh," she said. "That's what we do here." For the first time, Margaret smiled, a small one, tentative but real. After the paperwork, Alyssa gave them a list of resources. "There's a community clinic that offers free medications for seniors," she explained, "and a shelter that allows pets if you ever need a transition space." Michael noticed how she looked at him, not with judgment, but with awareness. She had seen veterans carry the weight of other people's survival before. "Take care of yourself too," she said softly. It startled him how much those words stuck. Next stop, the veterinary clinic. The building was small, with a mural of cartoon animals painted on the wall. Inside, a tall man in scrubs stepped from the back room. Dr. Neil Portman, mid-40s, was rugged and broad-shouldered, with a trim salt-and-pepper beard and dark wavy hair just beginning to recede. His hands were large, steady, hands accustomed to healing and holding creatures in fear. His voice was a low rumble, warm and patient. "And who's this handsome guy?" he asked, kneeling to Bruno's level. Bruno sniffed his hand, tail cautiously wagging. Neil examined him gently. Strong heart, sturdy joints, a little underweight, but nothing we can't fix. Margaret stood to the side, wringing the strap of her purse between frail fingers. "I wasn't always able to feed him properly," she whispered. Neil looked up at her, not with blame, but with respect. "He's lucky to have someone who stayed." Bruno nudged Margaret's knee, leaning into her hand. As they left the clinic, Neil called out, "Bring him back in 2 weeks, no charge." Margaret nearly stumbled. "Why?" Neil shrugged. "Because someone once helped me when I didn't deserve it." Michael recognized that look, the look of a man with his own ghosts. Days turned into a new rhythm. Michael reorganized the apartment, moving his medals and deployment photos into drawers, clearing shelf space for Margaret's small tin box of keepsakes. She hung a framed photo of David, her son, the firefighter, on the small wooden table by the window. Each time sunlight touched that frame, she seemed to breathe easier. At night, Michael worked on meal prep as Margaret folded laundry with the precision of a woman who had once taken pride in small domestic victories. Bruno claimed a new sleeping spot at the foot of Michael's bed. Sometimes, in the soft blue haze of dawn, Michael would wake to find Bruno's heavy head resting against his leg, as if the dog were standing watch. It was strange, comforting and disarming to not wake alone. One afternoon, as they returned from the grocery store, Margaret suddenly stopped on the sidewalk. She was staring at a young mother laughing with her toddler, holding the child's hand as they crossed the street. Margaret's breath faltered, and she pressed a hand to her chest. "I used to do that," she whispered, "with David." Michael stepped closer, not touching her, just standing beside her in shared silence. Presence, not instruction. The moment passed, and they continued walking. Healing wasn't a straight line. It was a fragile step forward, then a shaky pause, then another step. In the evening, sunset washed the apartment in honeyed gold. Michael stood near the window, watching the light reflect off Margaret's framed photograph of David. For the first time since his return from war, he felt something inside him loosen. Maybe healing didn't mean forgetting the battles behind him. Maybe it meant allowing someone else into the quiet after. Spring arrived without ceremony, only the soft insistence of longer light bleeding through the blinds each morning. Months had passed since the night Michael found Margaret and Bruno beneath the leaking awning. In that time, the apartment had changed from a shelter to something dangerously close to a home. But home, Michael realized, was not square footage. It was safety shared. Still, the apartment was cramped. Margaret often apologized for taking space, though she occupied it gently, knitting in the corner or watering the fern Jenna gifted her. Bruno adapted quickly, patrolling each night from doorway to kitchen as if protecting a fortress with invisible perimeters. Michael knew it was time to give them more. When the lease renewal notice slid under his door, the answer surfaced before he could debate it. They deserved better than temporary. He began combing rental listings in quieter neighborhoods, places with trees rather than traffic. He wanted a yard for Bruno, sunlight for Margaret, and a place for himself that didn't echo when he walked. After 3 weeks of searching, he found it. A small, modest single-story house on a quiet street in Ballard, white paint chipping around the window frames, a porch with tired wooden planks, and a tiny fenced yard in the back. The backyard was wild with dandelions and untamed grass, messy in the way potential always is. The landlord, Mr. Carter, a man in his early 60s with a balding head and a belly stretching the buttons of his plaid shirt, had a habitual frown that made him look permanently inconvenienced. But his eyes were gentle, and when Bruno trotted up and placed his head beneath the man's palm, something in Carter softened. "Dog stays," he grumbled, as if Bruno had negotiated the lease himself. Margaret walked through the empty living room slowly, fingertips gliding over the windowsill. "There's light here," she murmured. She sat in the corner near the front window, as though her body knew immediately where it belonged. In that moment, Michael really saw, what home meant to her. Not ownership, not walls, permission to rest. They signed the lease that day. Moving was chaos disguised as cardboard boxes. Tobin from upstairs helped load furniture into the borrowed truck, swearing under his breath when he scraped his knuckles. He wore a rip-end tank top under an unbuttoned flannel shirt and smelled of cedar and guitar varnish. "I tune instruments, not my back," he muttered, though he carried more than Michael intended. Jenna dropped by with leftover hospital pastries, announcing, "Fuel for laborers," even though she practically ordered them to take breaks every 15 minutes. When Margaret thanked them, her voice trembled. She wasn't used to being helped. Community, like sunlight, can be overwhelming after too long in the dark. The house felt different the moment their belongings crossed the threshold. Margaret set her knitting basket near the window, immediately her new morning seat. Bruno sprinted into the backyard, paws kicking up grass and sunlight, running with such joy that Michael wondered if a soul could grow back muscle memory for happiness. Inside, Michael assembled a small wooden chair, a reading nook he bought for Margaret. It wasn't expensive, but it had weight and sturdiness, something that would not collapse. He placed her framed photo of David on the side table beside it. Margaret looked at the chair, then at him. "You made room for him," she whispered. He shook his head. "You made room for me." The house settled into a pattern. In the mornings, Margaret sat by the window knitting scarves she donated to the shelter, her silver hair glowing like frost in the sunlight. Bruno sprawled across the floor, heavy head on his paws, eyes tracking birds through the glass. Michael found work at a maritime security firm. Steady hours, predictable tasks, no gunfire. The boss, Aaron Bishop, was a tall, broad-chested former Coast Guard commander with a salt and pepper beard and a handshake that could dislocate shoulders. He was blunt, structured, and valued discipline the way some men valued religion. But, unlike the military, he listened when Michael described Margaret and Bruno and the need to leave early some days. "Family matters," Bishop said simply. And just like that, Michael officially had one. His first paycheck went not to himself, but to buying Margaret a proper recliner chair, soft leather, supportive for her back, in a warm brown shade that matched the sunlight. When the delivery truck arrived, Margaret protested, "Michael, this is too much." "No," he answered. "This is enough." Bruno tested the chair first by placing his front paws on it, sniffing around it, then nodding. Yes, dogs can nod, before settling back on the rug. Margaret eased into the chair and closed her eyes. The chair embraced her body like something built specifically for her small frame. "I haven't sat in anything this comfortable since..." Her breath softened. Michael didn't ask what memory followed. Some things were sacred because they stayed unspoken. Evenings became slow rituals, dinner simmering on the stove, Margaret's recipes on days she felt strong, Michael's attempts on others. The television murmured in the background, always on low volume, not to watch, just to remind them that life existed without needing to be fought. One night, as he washed dishes, Michael noticed Margaret staring out the window, not sad, just thoughtful. "You know," she said, "grief is like a heavy coat. You think if you take it off, you'll lose the last piece of the person you loved." Michael dried his hands. "Is that why you kept walking, kept surviving?" "No," she said, eyes shining. "I stayed because Bruno still needed me, and now," she looked at Michael, "now someone stays for me." Something warm expanded in his chest. Margaret and Bruno were not his responsibility. They were his choice. Later that night, Michael went to bed early, not from exhaustion, but from peace. For years, he had slept like prey, light, alert, ready to spring. But that night, Bruno curled at the foot of his bed, spine pressed lightly against his leg, anchoring him to the present. Michael slept deeply, unafraid of dreams. He didn't wake from phantom gunfire, didn't count breaths to fall asleep, didn't search the shadows for threats. The house was quiet, but not empty. Margaret breathing softly from the next room, Bruno's warmth at his feet, a life he hadn't expected, a life he hadn't dared want. When dawn seeped into the room, Michael opened his eyes slowly, unhurried. The world outside was still loud, unruly, broken in 1,000 places. But here, behind these walls, he had carved out something small and whole, not victory, not conquest, healing. He finally understood. Heroes don't only exist on battlefields. Sometimes a mission is not to save the world, but to save a life. And sometimes, that life saves you back. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder. They come quietly, disguised as ordinary people choosing kindness when no one is watching. Michael, Margaret, and Bruno prove that God often answers prayers through human hands, one act of compassion at a time. In a world rushing past its own miracles, may we slow down enough to see them, in the stranger who helps, in the small door that opens, in the moment a broken heart learns to rest again. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment, tell your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe, because the world is full of silent miracles, and together we can spread them. May God bless every viewer who watches, shares, and carries kindness into the ordinary days ahead.